live long and prosper. So in this video series, I'm going to be talking through the social justice elements of every episode of the original series of Star Trek. The thing that inspired this project was actually a Fox News article which argued that Star Trek has in some way betrayed its traditional commitment to sort of political neutrality or middle ground by embracing progressive politics. In this series, we're going to see that Star Trek has always embraced progressive politics, and it's always been aspirational for social justice in various senses. I am taking a broad perspective on social justice here, so that may include multiple different types of social justice, whether that's racial, whether that's economic, whether that's religious, whether that's abilities, gender and sexuality, anything broadly considered. I will go through every episode. Some of the episodes I will interview fellow Trekkies and talk with them about it. And then below, in the descriptions, I will give you additional information about the episodes, particularly their original air date, who wrote the screenplay, and who directed that episode. I also want to dedicate this series to my dad, Michael Allen Zapkin. He was an OG Trekkie from back in the day, and it was watching the original series with him that I came to love Star Trek. In this video, we're going to be talking about the episode A Taste of Armageddon. And I'm joined by my good friend Lew Lazarow, who is a fellow Trekkie and general lover of sci-fi. So first off, I'm going to let Lew introduce himself, and then he'll give us a brief plot synopsis, and then we're going to talk about some of the social justice elements of this episode. So first off, Lew, thanks for joining me.
Pleasure, Phil. I'm really happy and excited to be doing this. As Phil said, my name's Lew Lazarow. Phil and I were colleagues for several years. As he also mentioned, deep and abiding fan of Star Trek. I believe I've literally been watching it since maybe like I was 4 years old. And continued to this very day. General lover of all things sci-fi, that's also pretty accurate. Related to that, I also wrote and taught a course for many years on war and the fantastics, sort of an examination of warfare as it appears in fantastic settings and its correlation to actual discussion of warfare in the three-dimensional real world. So talking about A Taste of Armageddon, really honestly one of my all-time favorite of the original series Star Trek episodes, and really just perfect for a lot of things that I like to talk about and discuss. So let's hit it. So the crew of the Enterprise is en route to a mini R7. They have been ordered there to hopefully open diplomatic relations with the civilization that exists there. They are carrying a particularly obnoxious ambassador with a bit of a superiority complex, who's going to do the actual negotiations. While en route, they receive an answer to their mission that absolutely says, "Stay away. We don't want you to come here. Please don't." And of course, Kirk, who's prepared to turn around and be like, "Hey, we just don't violate those rules." The ambassador says, "Nope, we got to go in anyway." So Kirk goes, "All right, but well, no. They arrive there and discover that the civilization has been sort of at war for the past 500 years with its neighbor Vendikar. The reason why the war has gone on so long is that it's fought entirely by computers, where the computer simulates an attack, declares that this is what was hit and what it was hit with, and this is how many people are dead. And then those people have to dutifully report to a disintegration chamber, And this has been going on for 500 years. And the leader of Aminiar 7, Anon 7, says, hey, this is the way that we've been able to actually maintain a stable civilization. We've been able to grow and prosper, even though we have been continuously at war. We attack them, they attack us. Our people report to disintegration, and life goes on. Kirk, of course, is like, this is no way to live. And this is further complicated by the report that in the attack that happens while they're there on the planet, the Enterprise is deemed a casualty of war, and all of its crew are ordered to report to disintegration chambers on the planet. Well, Kirk's like, no way, that's not going to happen. Anon 7 tries a variety of different tricks in order to get them to abide by that decision. And Scotty, who's in charge up on the ship, is like, no way. They attack the ship. Scotty defends the ship. Fox, the ambassador, is super upset by this whole thing. Communicates with the Aminiars and says, I'm sure this was all just a misunderstanding. And they're like, oh, yeah, it was totally a misunderstanding. Why don't you come down and we'll work all this out? So Fox, believing, of course, that he's all on top of this, goes down. They promptly capture him and are about to shoot him into a disintegration chamber. Of course, Kirk and Spock and the rest of the away crew come to the rescue, and they start blowing up disintegration chambers, and this produces a whole degree of havoc. And finally, of course, Kirk gets the upper hand, takes the whole council of Aminiar sort of like hostage, as it were, and then he and Spock blow up the computer that is running the war, essentially. And everybody's, of course, like really freaked out by this. Oh my gosh, what are we going to do now? The Vendikars are going to attack us for real because we violated the treaty from 500 years ago. And Kirk kind of says, maybe you should go pick up the phone and talk to them, because otherwise this is going to end really badly for everybody here. And Fox says he's more than happy to stick around and help them to negotiate to a peaceful settlement. And the Enterprise flies off with this kind of Kirk's sort of final statement that the Aminiars are a very order-driven people, and he doesn't think that they're going to want to get involved in a real war, because real war is messy. And messy and order don't really fit well together. So he's hopeful that these guys are going to manage to work it all out.
Or they're going to kill Fox. Because he never shows up again in the series. No, okay, so that was a great synopsis. There's a lot to unpack with this episode. It
really is.
Considering that you have taught a course on war in sci-fi, and that this episode is centered on war, let's start with that. I guess the main maybe question that this episode raises, the most obvious question is this a good system for warfare? I mean, Anon 7 makes his case.
Right.
Kirk makes his case. Who's right and why?
So I think that when you talk to people who have actually endured warfare, like soldiers who have actually been through the circumstances of war, all of them tell you the same thing, that this is nothing that anybody wants to do. When you've been in actual warfare, there are things that you can't unsee and will never forget. I'll never forget a conversation that I had with a war veteran who said the thing that depictions of warfare that are like presented through mass media, the thing that no one ever seems to ever be able to understand, for good reason, is that war literally stinks. Like the stench of war is something that you can't forget. That sensory input, right? And I think that that's characteristic of what it is that we're looking at here, is that these people over the course of 500 years have distanced themselves from the realities of warfare, right? They've sort of carried out a war, but they've done so in sort of a sanitized for your protection kind of a way. That is warfare, but not true warfare. And Kirk, I think, very ably makes the point that that this isn't the way to solve a problem, because ultimately you're not solving the problem, right? If there's a problem between two people, war, by I think all of our sort of like best, most common sense judgments, war is your last resort. The last thing you want to do is go about killing other people to try to make your point about a thing. Violence is, and in fact, I think that one of the things that I like the most about this particular episode is the fact that it is a first season episode. So a lot of things are still kind of in development in the Star Trek world. Definitely. And I love the very singular moment where Kirk and Spock are sort of being held, sort of hostage, captive. And Kirk looks at Spock and says, we might have to kill some people in order to accomplish this. Yeah. And Spock kind of goes, yeah, I understand. That might have to happen. There's a real level of reluctance in that. There's this moment that says, look, we shouldn't have to do this, and we don't want to do this, but necessity may drive us. May, not going to, but may drive us to this point. Alternatively, you have the Eminarians who are basically just sort of like gas chambering 3 million people a year, based upon a computer's say so. I don't think even Spock mentions the fact that what it is that the Eminarians have done is eminently logical, which for him is supposed to be a really big deal, but that he doesn't agree with it. He says, you don't have my approval on this. I just understand what it is that you've done and how you've come about with this solution. But approval, no, we're pretty far away from that.
Yeah. So you've just raised a ton of fantastic points.
I do that.
No, and that's awesome. One of the things that you had said that struck me really is the idea of solving a problem. Because as I was rewatching this episode to film this video, the thing that occurred to me is there's no discussion whatsoever of what this war is about.
Right.
It's quite possible that the Armenians and the Vendicarians, whatever the
however you do
civilizations are, it's quite possible that they do remember what this war is about, but 500 years is a long, long time. If there was some concrete objective to be achieved, it seems intuitively like 500 years later, maybe that objective is no longer going to be relevant anymore. And like the thing that I think of course, I've spent my entire adult life basically with the United States at war in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. I'm a millennial. The invasion of Afghanistan happened. I think I was in my last year of middle school when that happened. So 20 years of warfare. The objective that we went into Afghanistan with, to the extent that we had a specific objective, like by 2020 or so, it was just no longer relevant. The world was a completely different place. And that's the thing that really struck me is like I get Anon 7's argument that this is a way to carry out the war without the destruction of their civilization, without disease, without the destruction of buildings, without the loss of art, culture, etc., etc. At the same time, I think Kirk very sort of ably makes this point. This is a way of having a 500-year war. Like, it's not a way of winning a war. There's no plan for final victory. It literally is just like I don't know. I'm not a boxing fan, but I understand that there are certain boxing matches in which like the fighters are just sort of done, but they mechanically keep hitting one another just because neither of them is knocked out yet. That's kind of what this war is, right? It is just they've attacked us, so we're going to attack them back, and it's continual, but there isn't Like, there's nothing that these civilizations are trying to achieve. Just war is their stasis.
Right. And I think that in thinking about that, war is their stasis. I think that that's a really critical statement. I agree with that. Because, of course, stasis functions until there's something from the outside that comes to disrupt that level of stasis. Humanity is always looking for this stasis point, right? They're always looking for, how do we keep things stable? How do we keep things the same? How do we reinforce ourselves against change because we like things the way that they are? Kirk and the Enterprise represent this kind of destabilizing force, which I think is one of the reasons why they've sort of put this isolationist zone around the system and say nobody can come in here, because to do so would potentially disrupt what it is that we've got. We've achieved balance, and it's kind of an Orwellian balance, right? That sort of sense of we're always going to be at war. You don't necessarily know why we're at war, but we're always at war, and war is our stable existence, which then speaks to sort of one of the things that I noticed very readily is that much of Kirk and Anan, when they talk, right, their focus is on the philosophical nature of humanity, which is this idea that we are innately savage. And so this idea of a continuous state of war is more, I think, of this sort of like an expression of the innate human existence, right? Like this war is who we are. It is our natural state. The other state, this idea of being at peace, that's actually an unnatural state. That's not how we're built. That's not what we're meant to do. We're innately savage. We're innately barbarians. And so why not give expression to this, but in the safest way possible, right? We're going to plan a war. We're going to set this thing up. We're going to set it in motion. And then there never has to be this level of like instability where these years we're at peace, but now we're going to go to war, and then we're going to solve that, but we're going to go back to peace. And then this back and forth never has to happen, because we're going to achieve a stasis point. We're going to give that sense of our own savagery this expression. And so therefore, we never have to evolve. We never have to grow. We never have to change. And that I think that speaks really clearly to our own sense of self, right? This sense of fighting against our worser natures and striving to become better than what we are at the moment. Kirk is willing to recognize the fact that we've got these nasty tendencies about ourselves. There are things that as humans we probably shouldn't like, and there are things that we shouldn't do, and we struggle against them, even though we know that there are sometimes we're going to give in to them. Those darker natures are going to get the better of us, and we're going to do things that later on we're going to regret. And he says we fight against that stuff, whereas Anon 7 is just like, why? I mean, just recognize that that's who you are and roll with it. Yeah.
I mean, Kirk has this great speech at the end of the episode. I don't think I'm going to be able to remember it exactly, but it's something along the lines of, yes, we're killers with the blood of 1,000 savage years on our hands. It's instinctive, but we can fight the instinct.
Right.
We can accept that we're killers, but we're not going to kill today. So I think that's an interesting thing. I love that speech, actually, but I want to push back, not necessarily push back, but maybe take a different perspective on one of the things that you had said. This question of stasis and the idea that peace is the aberration. From a historical perspective, that makes sense to me, because there's virtually no year in human history where somebody hasn't been at war with somebody. But maybe in this sense, Anon 7 is right. Like, if you are in a constant state of war, you can focus on culture, you can focus on philosophy, you can focus on technology, and you're not worried about, all right, we have to navigate diplomacy or politics, and we have this constant terror that a war is going to break out. if you're in the if you're in what's debatably the worst case scenario, and that's your stasis point, then because you don't have you're not trying to make peace, so you don't have that anxiety. And then if you make peace, you're not worried about maybe another war is going to break out. I mean, again, I think we're fundamentally supposed to see Kirk's position as right, because this is Star Trek and it's Kirk. But I mean, the Enterprise theoretically is on a peaceful mission, and yet they fight continually, and that fighting is a disruption to their exploration. It's a disruption to their diplomacy. It's a disruption to their scientific endeavors, etc., etc. And it's often not productive necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, maybe in this sense, Anon 7 is right.
If we posit that Anon 7 has something, and I think that there's reason enough to be able to sort of argue on his side. I think that there's enough that makes I think that's what gives the episode its complexity.
Yeah.
So we look at that and we kind of go, hey, right? It's not this very clear-cut black-white, kind of dichotomy. It grays pretty significantly through the middle there. I get that. So we'll posit that, okay, Anon 7's got a point. Do they solve the problem, as it were, of, this state of continual warfare in a way that's really sort of fair towards that particular mission of the Endicarians of let's focus on our culture, let's focus on our civilization, let's preserve all of that. They kill 3 million of their citizens every single year. Right. So
and that's, of course, the big problem.
Right. If your focus is the growth of your culture and the growth of your civilization, but you are randomly selecting 3 million people to die every single year, then what are you depriving yourself of? How can you develop a civilization? Because that and one that I think brings me to one of the other sort of interesting points. Their civilization, as Kirk, mentions at the end, is that these are a people who love order.
Yeah.
And not surprisingly, I did a second rewatch of it last night just so that I could retune. So I think I've watched it 3 times in the past week. And one of the things that you and I sort of coming from a literary scholarship background, we love the recurrence of particular words, right? A word that occurs multiple times throughout a particular work carries a degree of importance. And order, as a singular used word, appears a lot of times through this episode, between the idea of giving an order, following an order, or the desire for order. That word is repeated a whole lot of times. And that, I think, that sense of we're here for stability no matter what the cost. If it costs us 3 million citizens every year in order to maintain a level of stability, then hey, that's just what we're going to do. But that stability, that's that double-edged sword, because the stability doesn't give us the opportunity to grow because we're denying ourselves of the talent and the benefits of every one of those people who we've, walked into the disintegration chambers and said, this is just the sacrifice that, our people have to make in order to sort of keep things, the way that they are. And that I don't think is it a solution? Yes. Is it a good solution? I don't think that we can argue that the solution they've come up with is a good one.
Yeah, I think that's definitely fair. So I think I want to touch very quickly on your point about the sort of the gray areas here, because actually the thing that this episode kind of reminds me of is the best of Greek tragedy. Because Hegel says that the thing that makes tragedy great is agonistic conflict. That is, you have two competing ethical positions, each of which has merit and each of which has flaws, are presented as in conflict with one another. This is the best kind of, in my opinion, the best kind of structure that we see in Star Trek episodes is when we have these ethical dilemmas. I wanted to go back in terms of ethical dilemmas to something else that you had said earlier, which was the moment when Kirk is like, we may have to kill some people to put an end to this war. Because the thing that had struck me, this episode comes maybe like a month or so. This episode originally aired maybe about a month, 6 weeks after the episode The Galileo 7. And in that episode, when Spock is in command of the shuttlecraft on the planet's surface, the rest of the crew members in that shuttlecraft want to just kill as many of these indigenous sort of Sasquatch, Neanderthal guys as they can. Just straight up murder them. And Spock is like, I don't approve of killing for no good reason. So that's something that, like, we've gotten that aspect of his character developed, even though that's not necessarily super consistent, because he does kill over the course of the series.
Sure.
But in terms of that development of the Star Trek universe, this is very much an episode not governed by the Prime Directive, right? That later on becomes a big thing in the series, but it hasn't been invented yet.
Right, that's correct, yeah.
So for those of you who don't know, the Prime Directive is basically the Starfleet or the Federation rule that Starfleet personnel can never interfere in the development of other peoples or planets. What do we make of Kirk's pretty blatant interference here? Like, yeah, we can say it's better for Aminiar and Vendikar to be at peace, but does Kirk necessarily have the right to come in and say, I'm imposing peace on you?
So, I kind of take this out of Kirk's hands. It's very tempting to sort of, drop it in his lap and be like, dude, you violated what's ultimately going to become encoded as the Prime Directive, right? Non-interference, don't do that. It's easy to drop that in his lap, but I think that if we look at the progress and the way the episode is sort of designed, that goes to Fox, right? Fox is the one who says, they sent us an order not to come in here, and Fox says, we're disregarding that. This was our mission. This is what it is that I'm saying. So if anybody's responsible for that, I think you put that on Ambassador Fox, who absolutely should know better if we can argue that such a thing as the Prime Directive exists, even though it hasn't been officially named yet, that it's still this underlying element of sort of Federation philosophy. Yeah. Kirk, who at that moment is like, I got a guy, he gave me orders, and by rights of my rank and my, my position here, I have no choice but to obey, and therefore to do the best I can in this particular situation based upon the circumstances that I'm handed. I personally, from an ethical standpoint, I think that if Kirk was going to be court-martialed for this, for violating the Prime Directive, I think he's got a brilliant case to be able to say, dude, it wasn't me. My superior officer ordered me into a situation where I had no choice but to respond in this particular manner or risk the loss of my life, my entire crew's life. Basically did the best I can with what it is that I have. I think if anybody's at fault in this, it's Fox. He's kind of set up to be that patsy, right? Yeah. The arrogant superior who definitely knows better, an ambassador rather than an explorer, someone who doesn't, who isn't well versed in these first contact situations, kind of a thing, who just kind of bullies his way in, and then almost gets killed as a result of it.
So I do want to come back and talk more about Fox, because I find him a very interesting character. But I actually look at it a little bit differently, because later on, when the Prime Directive is actually encoded, like in the episode Bread and Circuses, we find out that Starfleet officers take an oath that they would rather die than violate the non-interference directive.
Right.
So, like, from a personal standpoint and from a practical standpoint, for not ending the series partway through season 1, I definitely see the benefit of not having Kirk and the entire Enterprise crew killed off. But again, in that universe of, and it's not necessarily fair to hold them to the Prime Directive in this episode, because again, it hasn't been invented for the Star Trek universe, but in the universe of the Prime Directive, I think a court-martial might say,
you took an oath.
It was your responsibility to order your crew to come down from the ship and go into the disintegration chambers rather than interfering with the development of this planet. Whether or not that's the right ethical thing to do is a different question than that. But I guess what I'm interested in with that is the rules of the Star Trek universe, which again don't exist yet. That over and over and over again. But because that Prime Directive doesn't exist yet, Kirk is allowed to go in and say, hey, you've had 500 years of stasis. I'm going to fuck it up in 3 seconds by blowing up your computers. Hope it all works out for you.
See ya.
Here, now he's in charge.
So that whole situation, and yeah, I absolutely get what it is what you're saying. And I mean, if we take the idea out of the equation that so much of Star Trek between the original series and then even later on into Next Gen is rife with moments of completely throwing the Prime Directive out the window.
Yeah.
Like, we're just gonna, here we go again, kind of a thing. It happens all the time. Because what's the point of having a rule if you're not going to continuously, end up in circumstances where you got to break the rule? Because that's just basically, that's TV trope right there.
Yeah.
I mean, come on.
If the rule was real, everybody in the show would be thrown out of Starfleet.
Right. Yeah, there would be no Starfleet because, right. But I think that what that broaches is this really amazing sort of like sub-commentary, to come back to the order thing, is the idea of obedience versus protest, right? Because I think that's a major underlying element of this entire episode. Who's giving an order? Who's obeying that order? Under what circumstances are they obeying? Or when are they refusing to obey that order? I think one of the sort of classic moments with Fox actually isn't with Kirk, but with Scotty, right? When Fox absolutely says, you're going to stand down. And Scotty's like, the hell you say I'm going to stand down? I'm not taking my orders from you, and you can do what you want, but I'm taking my orders from Kirk. I will
not lower the defenses.
I am not going to lower our defenses. These guys attacked us. I don't trust them for shit. And therefore, whatever you want to file in your report later on, that's fine. But you can forget about it. I'm not going to do it. That act of protest, which we all are looking at and going like, man, that's saving the ship. I mean, he's acting in the best interests, right? But you put that up against what the Eminarians are doing, which is a culture that is based entirely on obedience, right? It's like, oh, well, the computer has said you're dead, therefore please report to disintegration chamber 12. And everybody goes like, okay, well, here I go, right? I'm just gonna walk in. So this whole level of what order am I going to obey? What order am I going to disobey? Why am I going to disobey that order? Is it for a greater good? Is there something that I'm going to do in violating this rule that ultimately is going to have a positive outcome? Scotty says, I'm going to save the 500 people on board this ship, and if Kirk orders me to do a thing, I'm going to do it. Like, if Kirk orders me to lay waste to this entire planet, well, then he's my commanding officer, and, by God, I'm going to follow through on that. Even though that's a horrible thing, I'm basically going to kill this entire planet, but Kirk ordered me to do it, and therefore I'm set up to do it. And I'm sure that in Scotty's mind, he's thinking like, this is a gambit. Kirk is playing a game. He's played he's done an ultimatum card, and this is in some way going to have sort of a positive outcome. We're playing chicken here, and we're going to see who blinks first. I'm sure that that's what's going through Scotty's mind, because Scotty's got to know at this point that Kirk is like, I don't just randomly annihilate entire populations on planets. That's not who he is. So Scotty's willing to obey because he knows and trusts that what Kirk is doing is for the betterment of all. Likewise, we can say the same thing for the Eminarians, right? They are willing to obey because they believe that their leadership has their best interests at heart.
Yeah.
Because for 500 years, they haven't known anything else. So if, for patriotism and for the greater good, this is what it is that we have to do, then this is what it is that I'm going to do. One of the things in that sense that really struck me, I was turning it over this morning, is that, not surprisingly, right? You've got an episode that airs in 1967. World War II has been over for just past 20 years, which means that it's still very much a part of sort of the national consciousness, and it's really like a subject of much discussion, and it finds its way into a lot of literature. And earlier, I kind of referred to sort of walking into the gas chambers, with the disintegration, and I can't help but feel that there's that sort of sense of similarity. But the big difference, of course, is that where the Nazis were, saying like, oh, well, we're going to herd y'all in here and you're going to take a shower, and then they gas them to death, right? This level of deception. This is a really kind of interesting reversal, right? We want you to walk in there, but we're going to tell you this is exactly what it is that's going to happen. You're going to die walking into that chamber. And then people do it willingly. They're fully accepting that the order that I've been given is the right order, and therefore this is what it is that I must do. It's my responsibility to keep our world stable like this. That's that level of order and stability and obedience, right? That just says, I have to obey what it is that I've been told. That is absolute and invariable on the planet. And it's conditional on board the Enterprise, right? It's conditional from Kirk's perspective, where I've got this, prime directive thing, but there are circumstances, and I want to preserve life, but there are circumstances. And Scotty is like, I'm going to obey, but there are circumstances. That conditionality, I think, is everything. It's so much. It's so important, because that conditionality is the human existence, right? Where we're perfectly in like, we live in a society that is built around rules, and every one of those rules has exceptions where those rules don't apply. And our job is to look at the rules and go, I agree with this, but I agree with this, but.
Yeah. So a couple of things I want to mention here. First, one thing I always mention whenever Nazism or the Holocaust comes up in relation to World War II, like you and I, both William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy are Jewish, and so those, like, I'm sure that sort of imagery of the disintegration chambers, evocative of the gas chambers, as you point out. I'm sure that they were well aware of that, especially in
67,
early 67. But I actually think I'm thinking maybe like not better, but a different historical connection is actually World War One, right? Because if the Armenians, if the Bendikarians conceptualize everyone in their civilization as soldiers, right? The horror of World War One, apart from like gas attacks and things like that, which were obviously horrific in themselves, but the horror of World War One was you were ordered to go over the top and just walk across no man's land and get machine gunned, and people did it over and over and over and over and over for years, knowing that the attacks were at best going to get a few feet of ground, and there was no strategic benefit to it. Like, not always, but so often that is a key component of being a soldier, right? Is you have to be willing to die, even if it achieves nothing, even if there's no strategic value in it. And it's kind of a horrific idea that these two planets have essentially put everyone in their civilization into that military mindset. Even if it's a sanitized, you get disintegrated, it's painless. Like, it's a kind of horrific thing And in the context of 1967, like I don't remember what year the Vietnam draft started, but in the context of the escalating Vietnam War, I think the draft was already in place by 67, but I'm not 100% sure about that. But in the context of a war where resistance to the draft was a really central component of the anti-war movement, like the draft to a certain extent represent, and I mean, I have a selective service card somewhere. The idea that anybody can be drafted, or any man of a certain age can be drafted, kind of implicitly militarizes the entire population of the country.
So interesting points. I like your thinking. The concept, of course, of total warfare. I mean, absolute and total warfare, where everything and everyone is a target, and especially, right, the introduction of atomic weaponry, of nuclear weaponry, that, you know, like 300,000 people can die in an instant. That sort of, it brings a whole new perception to this idea of the concept of war. But here's the interesting part, I think, right? And considering who the audience of Star Trek was at the outset, total warfare is a thing that happens 1,000 miles away. It doesn't happen to us here at home. Right? So if you're an American, right, then warfare is the thing that happens to other people. Total warfare is a thing that happens to other people. Maybe it's the thing that we do to other people, and that unfortunately our soldiers have to suffer through over there, right? You know, World War I, right? World War I, World War II, Vietnam, all of these things those things happened over there. And there's that sense of clinical distance among the Aminarians, right? This is a war, and they've taken it to sort of its like ultimate extreme. It's a war that kind of only happens in the electronic digital environment, right? We mathematically launch an attack.
It's Battleship.
Right, exactly. We're playing this huge game of, you know, like of war games, of Battleship. And so there's an unreality to it. And I love the fact that in 1967 is the year that we start getting casualty reports on the nightly news from Vietnam, right? So instead of just, oh, things are happening over there, now all of a sudden we're getting actual numbers of how many people we're losing on a daily basis, right? Every night were being reported. And then, you know, if we go a little bit further on, obviously, you know, into the future, you know, past the episode, but the embedded reporters and the journalism that's coming back, and now the visuals of what it is that the war looked like. Now it's not photos from from the battlefield from World War I, or newsreel footage, you know, from World War II when we go to the movie theater,
heavily censored
by the War Department,
edited.
right? Exactly. Now all of a sudden it's the real thing. And what is it that produces that level of horror? But our recognition of this is, we're looking at the horrors of war, a thing that they don't have, right? That's been removed from them, so that it's all clinical, logical, and mathematical. And to go back to one of the things that you said about the idea of going up over the top in World War I, well, it was the same thing in Vietnam, right? The idea of, you know, we're going to run up and we're going to take this hill. Why did we take this hill? We don't know why we took this hill. Right? But we had to have it, but we're going to leave it, and then they're going to take it back, and then we're going to have to go and take it again. The whole Hamburger Hill, you know, sort of like, you know, like war mentality, which, I mean, that's not a war thing, that's a war thing, right? That's every war is from the soldier's perspective of, what did we do? Why did we do it? Did it make a difference? Kind of a thing. Like, we have to hope that the people in charge know what it is that they're doing, are doing these for the right reasons, that our lives are not being sacrificed in vain. So that there's a larger plan, which of course the Aminarians don't have, right? There is no larger plan. It's just wars, continuation for the stability of society. This is going to go on forever, right? And the notion, of course, of a forever war is a common thematic element, especially in science fiction, kind of reflective of the idea of real human war that seems to go on forever, especially from the soldier's perspective of the war that never ends, that we're always going to be doing this.
And again, I think the war in Afghanistan is a great
example.
Is a great example of this. as a war with, like, you stay because you haven't won yet, but because there's no strategic objective, there's no way to define
what winning means.
It becomes a situation in which, because there's no way to define having won, you can never achieve winning, and therefore you can never leave. Yeah. So I do want to talk a little bit more about Fox, because I think he's an interesting cat, or an interesting fox. Because to go back to the episode, the Galileo 7, there's another diplomat ambassador thing. And like, this is a very common pattern for Star Trek, right? Where the diplomat or whoever it is just a dick who's like, I'm going to take command of this ship and I'm going to do whatever stupid, ill-advised thing I want to do.
My mission has priority.
My mission has priority. You're going to take my orders. And so Fox, in the first portion of the episode, particularly in his interactions with Scotty, the thing that you had talked about with you will lower the screens as a show of good faith, Fox is that sort of stereotypical Star Trek dick ambassador.
Right.
But when he's on the planet and they're like, oh, sorry, but you're a casualty, so we're going to disintegrate you. And then Kirk and Spock save him and blow up the disintegration chamber. Fox is basically like, I've never been a soldier, but I learned very quickly. You got me and my random assistant, who then gets killed anyway.
Right, promptly.
Like, yeah. So Fox actually is like, Fox, that's one of the things that really is surprising to me about that character is that rather than the rigidity of I've given orders, now you follow them, that he displays with Scotty on the planet, he's like, all right, the situation calls for me to engage in military action rather than diplomacy. I'm now willing to do that. So
is that just a result of the fact that he sees like his life in imminent danger? Like sensing that mortality and like being literally like feet away from the disintegration chamber, like they're ready to toss him in. Like,
yeah, like he's got his hand on the edge
like,
to keep himself out. Yeah. I don't know. What do you think? Is it just I don't want to be disintegrated, or is it I've genuinely recognized that this is a situation in which the rules have to be broken for a larger cause?
I think that it fits very neatly into that pattern. I think that we can feel it's tough to look at this episode because, look, even though it's one of my favorite episodes,
yeah,
most people are like, it's kind of like B+, right? I mean, lots of A's for effort, but still there are these weird moments. And I think that moment for Fox is one of those moments that kind of pulls it down just a step, because you've got a guy who has basically been committed to this particular way of doing his job for like probably his entire career, right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, this is just who this guy is. Like, he's the dick, right? He's, I'm the ambassador. I expect to be obeyed. I'm the top dog here. And then, for him to suddenly be put in this situation that threatens his very mortal existence, and to have this very dramatic and sudden reversal that puts him in line with Scotty's level of protest and Kirk's level of protest, it doesn't feel as genuine to me as it might otherwise. I think that it's I don't want to call it appropriate, but it's in keeping with the thematic resonance that's going on through the episode of rules are there, but we have to understand that circumstances sometimes dictate that we act otherwise. I get that. I think that there's no level of resistance or regret on Fox's part where he says, but you don't understand. Like, what I do is negotiate peace. I don't take up arms. That's not who I am. He doesn't have that moment where he experiences, this is a real sea change for me. He almost just casually throws this line off that's just like, oh, I can learn, pew pew pew. You know, like, I can pull a trigger, like, you know, I'm fine, you know, like, put me in, coach. And that, I don't know, it lacks a level of, I think, of authenticity, just in terms of a human character development moment. And like I said, I get it. I'm not going to say I regret the choice that they make at that moment. I think that it's what takes this down. A part of the problem, I think, that a problem, it's not a huge problem, but like, this episode comes on the heels of Spacey, which is like totally like one of the most brilliant of all, you know, Star Trek episodes, like literally of all time, like, you know, to the present day. So like, you're not going to bat 1,000 like 2 episodes in a row like that. So, you know, when we're watching them in order and we're like, ah, man, this one just doesn't quite have the stuff. Like, well, look at what it is that you're coming off of. I think Fox is a necessary character. I mean, I think we have to have that level of antagonism on board the ship. I think it's one of the things that Trek relies on to create tension. I think it's what help establishes our sense of who Kirk is and why we want to feel that connection to him, because he's willing to stand up to the bullies, right? You know, he doesn't, like, he's like, I'm going to go along with you up until the point where I can no longer go along with you, and then we're gonna part ways. And then, of course, the bullies, you know, see that, you know, Kirk's way is the right way, and they develop a new sense of appreciation, and we all say, you know, I mean, it's a necessary sort of like TV developmental moment. I would have liked to have seen, you know, Fox have more of a moment at that moment. Maybe that's just me.
No, I think that's perfectly legitimate, and probably realistically, the limitation is it's a 42-minute episode or whatever it is.
Right.
Fox is not the central character. His conflict is not the central conflict. It's every on-screen romance that Kirk has. It's like, okay, you have to be willing to accept that Kirk really feels something for this person he's known for 12 and a half seconds.
And never going to see again.
And if you sort of say that's not long enough for Kirk to actually develop a genuine emotional connection, it's one of those things. I think you kind of have to just sort of willingly suspend your disbelief in that, in reality, Fox likely would have much more of a personal conflict.
A real ethical sort of moment,
Yes, now I'm betraying who I am as a diplomat. And then
I think that it perhaps, I don't know if it helps us to understand it, but like if we recast this and if we think about Roddenberry, right, and Roddenberry's vision for the series, and again thinking about this as being part of season 1, right, Roddenberry's concept was wagon train to the stars. So the underlying element, if we recast everybody in a Western, right, you know, like as all of these characters, then Kirk is the rough and tumble cowboy who's, you know, come in off of the plains and recognizes that things aren't right and that are wrong and that they need to be set right. But Fox is the sheriff who believes that because he has the badge, he therefore has the authority and therefore must be obeyed. And it doesn't matter the fact that, you know, that he's out of touch or that he's not dealing with the situation in the right way or doesn't understand what it is that's going on. It's the fact that he's wearing the badge, and that's it. And of course, the outsider is always going to be the one who sees the situation and then you know says, you know, there's another way that we're going to be able to handle this. And not surprisingly, that the authority appropriate for the 60s, right? The authority is not going to have the answers, right? It's, you know, that traditional authority, the badge wearing fools, they're not going to solve this problem, but those of us on the ground, we're going to solve the problem.
Yeah. All right. I think we've covered a good amount of ground here.
We've had fun. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we could probably keep talking about this for another couple of hours.
I know for sure I could.
For the purposes of YouTube, any last things that you really want to cover that we haven't touched on yet?
I think the only other sort of thing that just is worth just sort of dropping in there, and I'm sure anybody who watched the episode notices that there's a really interesting thing about the fact that we really only have 3 female characters in the episode. But Uhura fulfills her expected role. She's the communications officer, and she does her thing, and she's competent at her job, and we appreciate that. Mia 3, of course, is the eye candy for the episode, and she's helpless and she obeys. And in the sense of developing the episode, she does what it is that she's supposed to do. She's that prototype of obedience that says, "I just have to do what it is that I'm told."
Yes.
And you kind of wish that it wasn't like that, but you at the same time you kind of understand it. And I love the fact that singular moment for the women in this episode. I love the fact that Kirk hands that yeoman a weapon and says, "Do your job and keep an eye on her. And frankly, if you have to kill her, then kill her, but just make sure that she doesn't go and, do something crazy or stupid or anything like that." I love the fact that in that moment that Kirk, is given this sort of sense of character that the people under my command, all of them are trained and all of them are equal in that regard. And that yeoman, even though she's wearing the little dress, she's as capable of handling a weapon as any of the rest of them. Big props for the writers for giving her that moment, because it could have just as easily been one of the red shirts, neither of whom who die in this episode.
That's true. And actually, that yeoman is wearing a red uniform as well. Everybody lives.
Everybody lives, except for that poor schlep, the aide-de-camp for Fox.
Yeah, he didn't matter. He didn't even have a name.
He didn't have a name.
No, actually, I think that's a really, really important point. Because actually, as I've been rewatching these episodes and thinking about them from a social justice perspective, I've said this in previous videos about episodes. Star Trek is supposed to be set in a sort of gender equitable society, but it's really important to remember this is the 60s' idea of a gender equitable society.
Correct.
And so, I keep coming back to the Galileo 7 as an episode, just because that one happens to be fresh in my mind. But in that episode, when Spock is he's sort of taking a vote on whether or not they should kill these indigenous creatures, the one person in that group he doesn't ask is the female. I don't remember if she's a yeoman or what her rank is, but she's the one person who doesn't get a vote. But the other thing that I think is interesting about the yeoman, I want to say her name is Tamara.
It's close.
I don't remember. It just
Tamora.
Yeah. The other thing that's striking to me, or that's noteworthy to me, is that she's Japanese.
Right.
And I mean, Sulu is Japanese. So
he's not on the show yet, so.
No, Sulu is.
Oh, I not in this episode.
Yeah, he's not in this episode. But that idea, I think, is really, really important. Again, if we come back to the World War II context, but also Vietnam and even the Korean War, the idea of Asian American or Asian actors being entrusted with weapons, being entrusted as members of the crew, in much the same way that when Chekhov comes along later on, the idea of having a Russian on the crew.
Right, at a time of heightened hostility.
Yeah.
No, those are obviously very deliberate choices that speak to the concept of the show, but also the mindset of the people behind the show to say, well, here's what it is that we're trying to do. Here's the message that we're trying to send. This is absolutely the right move to put these people, to put weapons in their hands, to put them in positions of significance, of power, of decision making, of control.
Trust.
And trust. Yeah. Awesome.
Great. So I think we're going to leave it on that very positive note. Star Trek's hopeful
vision of the future.
Element. Yeah. So, Lou, again, thank you so much for talking to me. It's been really, really interesting.
Absolutely, a true pleasure. I really enjoyed this conversation. Let's do it again sometime, huh?
Yeah.